All right, joining me on the line today is a friend of the show and also an author of a new book entitled Franchise Warnings: What You Really Need to Know Before You Buy. He's a returning guest, David Barnett. David, great to have you on the program today.
Well, thanks for inviting me back, Jerry. It's always fun to be on the air with you.
Absolutely. I have been kind of skimming through your book here. Of course, the last book that you had put out and we brought you on the program to discuss was the Invest Local book. I know several people in our audience had a chance to pick that up, look it over, and it's a unique way to look at investing. We typically think of investing in the stock market. We think of investing in other types of investments, but investing locally, it's kind of coming of age, and your book really talked a lot about it to help people understand how to get started with that. Your new book, Franchise Warnings, very interesting here, David, seeing your background, and I think this book really complements your background. Here you are, a person who has owned a franchise of your own, and in fact, that franchise that you owned actually specialized in selling other businesses and franchises. So you've been on both sides. You've sold franchises as a business broker, and you've owned a franchise. So it really brings a lot of clarity, I think, to the topic here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book? I can tell you have a burden on your heart as you wrote this book. It seems like you want to get a message out.
Yeah, I do, Jerry. I spent several years as a business broker helping to buy and sell businesses. In fact, over a 3-year period, I did 36 deals. So on average, it was one per month. Of course, it doesn't work out that way on the calendar, but almost a third of those businesses were franchises. So I either helped people buy a new franchise, or I helped people buy a franchise that was already open and running. So by extension, I was also helping the owners of that existing franchise sell their business. I was also able to give advice to some regional franchisors that operate near where I live who were looking for help and advice on how to grow their systems. And the reason that I wanted to write the book is because when I go out into the marketplace of book and material and knowledge, I find a lot of books about franchises, and they're all about how to choose the right franchise and why a franchise is a great thing. And the reason is, Jerry, is that so many people, I like to say, have their hands in the cookie jar. There's a huge industry around selling franchises, and there's a lot of money to be made in that industry. And I just didn't think that there were enough voices out there sharing all the other things that could happen if you want to get into one of these types of businesses. So the book is largely based on stories and experiences that I've either witnessed and been a part of, or unfortunately have had people sit in front of me and explain their sad story of what happened.
Yeah, thus the title, Franchise Warnings. My guest is David Barnett. He wrote the book Franchise Warnings: What You Really Need to Know Before You Buy. David, let's backpedal just a moment and talk about the difference between a franchise business and just a regular mom-and-pop business for the folks out there in the audience.
Sure. If you're going to open a franchise business, you're usually buying a package of goods or assets from a franchisor. These typically include, trade name, trade style. So, you think of the most famous franchise of all would be McDonald's. So you buy that franchise, you get the right to put up the big golden arches in front of your business, right? Critical, though, in the whole thing is you get the system. How do I run this business? So again, for that, the example of McDonald's, there's going to be a big book that says, here are the different roles in the company, and this is what the different people do, and here's your step-by-step checklist on how to make a Big Mac, right? Every little detail of everything that's done in the business is going to be within these operational systems. The idea or the promise behind a franchise is that a person who doesn't know how to run a business is going to be able to take this off-the-shelf system, execute it properly, and increase their chances of success. And you pay for it typically in two ways. Number one, there's a franchise fee when you get started. This is your ticket to the ball game, as it were. But then there's the ongoing fee that you pay all the time. And this can be a royalty of your sales. It can be a percentage of sales for advertising, or it can be fixed fees depending on how the system is set up. If you have your own independent business, of course, you're not going to put out money for all those things. You're going to have to create them on your own. You're going to have to create your own brand. You're going to have to try to establish goodwill in the market for that brand yourself.
I've seen a lot of statistics about the success rates of franchises versus the success rates of the average small business. Can you talk about that a little bit, how accurate that is, having been in the business on both sides?
Yeah, I can. One of the things that you will see very often is a comparison between the number of independent businesses that are still open after 5 years and the number of franchises that are open after 5 years. And in my book, I stop and I try to use some logic to consider why those differences can exist. Number one, to buy a franchise, Jerry, you got to have some money and you have to have some net worth. So the people who buy a franchise are more fiscally stable. They've got more money in the bank. If you get into a business that loses money and you have money, you can afford those losses for longer, correct?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Number two, the most common lease term out there for commercial real estate is a 5-year lease. For many small businesses, even franchises, you're going to have some sort of operating company. You're going to set up a corporation, 1234 Alabama Inc. maybe, and it's going to be using, the franchise name on the front door. But the landlord is going to want a personal guarantee typically on that lease as well from the owner, okay? So if I get into a franchise situation and I'm not making money and I've personally guaranteed the lease, it might make sense for me to carry on a money-losing business to the end of that lease so that I get away without having to face personal repercussions for defaulting on the lease, right?
Sure.
Okay. One of the reasons why independent businesses can fail so quickly is, undercapitalized. The people don't have as much money, but a lot of people turn to self-employment who really would rather be employees. So I can also imagine these statistics get skewed by people who get into business and then get a job offer and decide to wind it up.
Sure, that makes sense.
Right? So and then lastly, and this was one that my good friend Rick, who wrote the foreword of the book, he brought this up because when somebody says our franchise locations on average are open, longer, they have a greater success rate, you also have to dig in and ask, is it the location that's open or is it the original franchisee that's still there?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Right? Because sometimes someone will get into a money-losing proposition and they'll go ahead and sell that business at a significant loss just to avoid things like the personal liability maybe on the lease. So that business can carry on. Right here in my hometown on Main Street, 2 months ago, a franchise restaurant shut down. The franchisee invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment and leasehold improvements and decor and signage to open up that place, and obviously didn't make it. It was closed down. There was an article in the newspaper about it. It's public knowledge. Now it's been announced in the newspaper that the business is reopening. Well, who do you think is reopening it, Jerry? It's the franchisor that has taken it over as a corporate store. Mm-hmm. So the franchisee invested all the money. They made the risky choices. They put in their good hard-earned cash, and now the franchisor gets to operate the business at a better margin than the franchisee had because, of course, the franchisor doesn't have to pay itself royalty fees.
Quite a twist. And that actually brings me to my next question. The question is if you have, for example, a franchise concept like McDonald's where you have this burger that just seems to sell so well, it's very tasty, or the French fry recipe that everybody has to, delight themselves in. Well, why would a company decide to franchise that idea as opposed to keep it corporate? And you really do a good job of kind of breaking that down very logically in the book. Explain why a company may decide to franchise its business and turn it into a franchise concept.
Well, it all comes down to access to capital and the speed of growth. So if you compare a franchise system, there are franchise systems out there that can double themselves every year. 20 stores, then 40, then 80, then 160. Compare that to a chain. How long did Sam Walton have to work one store before he was able to open his second, right? And then
so it really
third.
comes down to the speed and to the access to capital.
Right. So if you're going to grow as a chain, you've got to be able to earn profits and grow your balance sheet so that a lender will continue to advance credit to you and you can expand through opening new stores. If you're a franchise system, though, you don't need capital to open new stores. That's what the franchisees are for. They bring the capital to the table. The other thing that they bring to the table is management that cares. Big companies like Coca-Cola, they can afford the type of wages it takes to get a really good manager that cares, right? And these corporate warrior types that work 80 hours a week and they're totally devoted to their career. It's very hard to get that kind of person in charge of a fast food restaurant.
That's a great point.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense, especially in some of these hospitality type of industries as well. You want somebody who has some skin in the game, some real skin in the game, so that because, let's think about it. I mean, I've never owned a fast food restaurant. I don't know if you have or if you've sold them before, but you can imagine that it's a very taxing kind of management compared to other because of the high turnover rate. And so you need somebody in that management role who has some skin in the game, who has a great incentive to keep that business open and not just have a regular run-of-the-mill manager. I wonder if there's any statistics on that show that franchise hospitality type of companies actually outperform their peers.
Well, I don't know, and I didn't do research on that topic specifically. But I think if you look at the landscape, every town's got a golden mile, as it were, where you find all of those names lined up with each other on the side of the road. And it really is amazing how many of them are franchises versus corporate-run systems. You've got places like, the Olive Garden is a chain, but for every one of those, you seem to have 2 or 3 of the franchise names, don't you?
Sure.
Yeah.
I know the McDonald's, the KFC, the Chick-fil-A's, I believe, as well. I don't know if Chick-fil-A is a franchise or not, but there's many different. And we tend to think of restaurants when we think of franchises. What are some of the other less-known companies that are also franchises, David, that we may not know about?
Well, there's all kinds of ones, for example, in home service. I had a consultation call actually just on Monday with a franchise owner who has been running a property service franchise for the last 2 years, and they do lawn maintenance in the summer and snow removal in the winter. They've been running for 2 years. They have a huge amount of debt because they had to acquire a lot of equipment. And they got from their franchisor a brand name, which was new in the market and nobody knew. And they got online systems to manage sales and customer relationships and that type of thing. And they've been working at it for 2 years, and they haven't made any money. And they were calling to find out from me what my opinion was about different options they had out in front of them. And what's interesting is that the business actually is a profitable business that represents a revenue stream, just not to them. Because when I asked them, what kind of franchise fees have you been paying for the last 2 years? They said that they paid on average $50,000 a year in franchise fees. So when I say that a franchisor is looking for a manager in every location that cares, I'm not talking about the manager of the restaurant. I'm talking about someone to manage their cash flow.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Every one of those locations represents a stream of revenue to that franchisor. So, Ray Kroc was the famous guy who took the McDonald's concept and rolled it out across the country. And many other people look at that and say, gee, would I ever love to be another Ray Kroc and have all of these other people everywhere going to work every day, working hard, and I get a cut off the top. Jerry, it's like taxation, isn't it? It doesn't matter what the bottom line is. The cut's off the top.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about the person out there who perhaps has been considering a franchise. No doubt people can go into the bookstore, take a look at some magazines, and like Entrepreneur Magazine, and of course the back pages of that are filled with all kinds of outrageous promises of great wealth by simply locking into this new franchise concept or buying into this particular concept. And I've also noticed that the prices of at least the upfront, the bait, the numbers that they actually use as bait in many of these ads are very low. So it makes it sound very affordable. But your mention of the ongoing franchise fees is probably where some people get into trouble with this. But let's talk about the process of actually buying a franchise. How does someone actually go about buying a franchise? What does that look like? Well,
typically what I see someone who they need an income, or they're very dissatisfied maybe with their employment and they want something different. And they might be a little bit fearful about starting something on their own, or they feel that they're not experienced enough. So they go out and they go looking for an opportunity that is sort of ready-made. And that's what makes franchises attractive. And that is ultimately the promise of what franchises are supposed to be delivering. So you talk with someone, maybe a franchise consultant, because there are companies that specialize in helping you find the right franchise. And maybe you do an aptitude test or something like this, and they present you with different opportunities. And where I find people fall down in this process is that they get a little bit of what I call buyer fever. So they get excited either about the dream of the future state. So they start to romanticize what it's going to be like to be the owner of this business, and that gets them excited. Or they fall in love with the product. So let's say you were looking at fast food businesses and you really enjoyed Big Macs. So you wanted to own a McDonald's because you liked the product. Okay? And they lose sight of what the real product is. The real product is brand awareness. If I buy this franchise and I get a hold of this brand name, will the people in my community recognize it right off as being a good product? In my book, I use the example of Papa John's because where I live, I'm in New Brunswick, Canada, just across the border from Maine. And, of course, we get to watch American television networks here. So for 15 years, people have been seeing Papa John's commercials on television, but there wasn't a Papa John's here until about 5 years ago. So some guy opened up the Papa John's franchise here, and on day one, there was goodwill in the market. People knew the name, they recognized the name, and they said, let's go try that Papa John's pizza that we've seen on television for a decade, right? So is the brand going to be valuable? And what are the systems? Show me the operations manual. And this has been the most surprising thing to me in my experience and from the stories that I've heard, is that some of these businesses don't actually have very good systems and operations manuals. That they'll tell you they do, but the proof is not in the pudding. The actual systems don't exist to the degree that they need to be there. And that is the product. You're buying a system that you can follow to make money.
When it comes to actually pulling the trigger and actually making the purchase, like actually buying the franchise, do you typically, as you mentioned, there's usually a consultant that helps you do that, but when you actually buy the franchise itself, are you interfacing directly with the franchise? Is that what you or the franchisor? Is that what you recommend, or do you recommend using a broker? You've been on both sides of that. What's your recommendation?
Well, ultimately, you have to deal with them directly because they're going to, you're going to sign their contracts and their agreements and everything, and they pay fees to brokers and advisors to bring those people to them. So and in my book, I talk about that franchise fee. What exactly are you paying for that franchise fee? And they'll tell you it's the upfront cost for all these things that they have developed. But the truth is, Jerry, you know that once you have a system developed and it's in a book, it doesn't cost much to photocopy the book. When you pay that franchise fee, you're actually covering the cost of marketing the system to yourself. Because a good chunk of that franchise fee goes to those brokers and intermediaries that helped introduce you to the franchise system. And the other part of it goes towards the marketing expense of paying the people in the franchise system to go out and try to sell it and to attend all those trade shows and everything. In my book, I talk about making a side-by-side comparison. So if you find a really great franchise that you like, and you can say to yourself, well, if the market for this product is great, what would it take for me to recreate this business on my own? Would I be able to hire someone from this industry that has 40 years experience that could help me set up? Could I pay them as a consultant to hold my hand for 3 months? Instead of paying that franchise fee, could I hire a top-notch graphic designer and marketing person to put together an effective brand that's going to resonate in my local area? Especially if you're talking about bringing a new franchise into an area. There are professional services franchises now in accounting. There are professional services franchises in the area of organizing mastermind groups. Like, it doesn't matter what kind of business you can dream up, you're going to find a franchise out there. So if you're going to pay a fee to bring something new into your market that no one's ever seen before, why aren't you just bringing your own brand into the market?
Because the fees are going to be so expensive and exorbitant that you really need to have, unless as you mentioned, the operating system itself is stellar, and they have figured out something that you could not figure out on your own, then that makes a whole lot of sense. What about people who buy a franchise and, as you mentioned earlier, 5 years in, they feel like they're losing money, they feel like this is not a good decision? How easy is it to sell a franchise? Is it different based on the company? In other words, is there kind of a general rule of practice? Can you sell the franchise back to the corporation who sold it to you, or do you have to go out and find a buyer? Are you kind of on your own? What's that process look like?
Well, actually, it's a little bit of a Frankenstein process because you've got three parties that are involved. And in the franchises that I've helped to sell, it typically works like this. The franchise owner has to go out and try to find a buyer, but then once that buyer is identified, they have to be approved by the franchisor. So in one case, there was a franchise restaurant that I had to sell 3 times. The first 2 buyers who were willing and able ended up being, one was declined by the franchisor, and the other, after meeting the franchisor, came back and said, I don't want to do business with those people. They had left such a bad taste in his mouth. So this poor franchisee who was trying to sell his business, I mean, this process dragged out for 1.5 years before a deal was finally done that would satisfy both him and the franchisor. And you talk about how difficult can things be. Businesses are evaluated based on a function of their cash flow. I was working with some newly arrived people from Israel, actually, here in New Brunswick, and they were looking at a franchised restaurant that was for sale. And looking at the cash flow of the business, I told them that it was probably worth about $175,000, give or take, within 10% range. Now, the franchisees that owned the place were at the end of their franchise agreement, and there was a mandate from the franchisor to update the decor and add an additional franchise system. So these people owned one franchise, and the franchisor sells multiple brand names, and they wanted this place to become a dual name location. So upon transfer of the franchise, the new owner was going to have to pay a $30,000 fee to acquire the second name, and was due for a look and feel decor update, which they estimated was going to cost $100,000. So after looking at all this, I advised them. I said, well, you have to go back to these sellers and you have to offer them $45,000. And at first they were shocked. They said, well, wait a second, Dave, we can't offer them $45,000. I think the asking price on the business was $150,000. We can't offer them $45,000. That's insulting. I said, you're not. You're actually paying $175,000. You're just not paying it to them. You're paying $100,000 to the contractor, you're paying $30,000 to the franchisor, and you're giving them the other $45,000. So these franchisees thought that they owned a business, but in reality, if you look at the definition of ownership, you're going to find that it's a bundle of rights. Okay, and one of the rights is the ability to sell or give away your property. Okay, they didn't have the ability to sell or give away their property without satisfying the other entity that had control over their situation. And that's where I come back to that expression that I love so much, and I know you like it too. When you own a franchise, you don't own a business, you're renting one. Because it
really sums it up.
You are a tenant. You're a tenant. And if you want to make a big change, you got to check with the landlord.
That's a great concept to think about it, because many times people can get bogged down in all the details, and that's a great way to think about it. If you're going to buy a franchise as opposed to just starting your own business, you're really not going to own that franchise, as you're saying. You're going to be renting that business. And in fact, you're basically buying an income. You're basically buying almost a job in that case. It almost makes sense to even say that.
Well, so, talk about buying a job. There's a great story in there from someone I know in Halifax, and they had actually acquired the master franchise rights in this region for a franchise name. And they were very excited, and it was their first time in business, Jerry. And they just thought this business was the greatest thing ever. So they got the rights for the region, and they started to go around to successful business people that they knew of or had seen in the newspaper, and they presented their opportunity. And one by one, all of these very successful business people turned them down. And they thought that it was very strange. So they went back to the franchisor and they said, we're having trouble selling these franchises. Everyone smiles politely, looks at our information, and then says it's not for them. And when the franchisor heard that they were pursuing successful established business people, the franchisor said, no, you're going after the wrong crowd. Who you need to be going after are retired naval officers, retiring civil servants, professionals that are getting downsized, and these people need to have good amounts of money in their retirement savings that they can have access to pay the franchise fee. Because what you're looking for is people that are used to following rules and systems, that are not too creative, and that have the money to pay us. And so that just about sums up who the franchise industry is out there targeting, who they're trying to get into these arrangements.
My guest today is David Barnett. He is the author of Franchise Warnings, What You Really Need to Know Before You Buy. David, in our final moments here, do you have any parting advice for people out there who are considering purchasing a franchise?
Yeah.
Obviously, the book is called Franchise Warnings. What are some of those red flags to look for?
I think the number one most important thing anyone can do if they're seriously considering buying a franchise, if they've analyzed what it would cost them to copy the model on their own and they still want to get into that franchise system, get into your car and drive to other cities where these franchises exist and talk face-to-face with other franchisees. You're going to hear the message that is not being filtered by the franchisor. You're going to see what they're doing. You're going to see the type of market they're doing it in. And you're going to be able to get a better idea of whether or not this is going to work in your market. And you're going to hear about the things that upset and bother these other people, because they know talking to you face to face, it's not, they're not exposing themselves or leaving a paper trail. You got to get in the car, and if it means taking a week to drive and visit 6 other cities, you need to do it, especially if you're going to be investing hundreds of thousands of dollars.
My guest today, David Barnett, the author of the book Franchise Warnings, What You Really Need to Know Before You Buy. David, how can folks pick up a copy of your book? How can they learn more about you?
Well, my book is available worldwide through the Amazon stores, and it's available on Kindle. And you can also buy it as an instant PDF download from my blog site, which is investlocalbook.com. investlocalbook.com, where they can also pick up your other book we've done an interview on before also, the investlocalbook.com. And, of course, you can also pick up a copy of this on our website there at ftmdaily.com. David, great to have you on the program as always, and I appreciate your time. Thanks, Jerry. It's always a lot of fun. Have a great day.